Hello Internet, I'm Zahn and welcome back to another video. Now this time we're going to be doing something a little bit different from the normal format of videos here on my YouTube channel. If you spent any amount of time on the internet or consuming YouTube-based content, you've probably seen a lot of people doing videos involving tier lists. And I've seen this from all sorts of different YouTube creators from different fields and different focuses. But basically what this is the site, TierMaker, which is tiermaker.com, allows you to either use uploaded templates of tier lists that people have made, or create your own in order to rate and rank whatever you want. It's a pretty robust tool and simple to use, and I thought I would give it a try because I've always wanted to do videos based on my opinions and analysis of certain things. And I looked around on the website and couldn't find anything on there related to the Guardian Legend. If you've been following the content on my channel over the last couple months or so, I've done a lot of videos on the fan-made game Shadow of Naju, which was based on the Guardian Legend, a fairly well-known but somewhat cult classic of a video game from the NES platform. And when I was doing the Shadow of Naju Let's Play in the subsequent arcade mode, I thought to myself it would be interesting if I did a tier maker based on ranking the weapons that the character uses in the Guardian Legend. And what I can do real quick is grab my directory here. So what I've prepared here is a basic tier list from S to D, S being the highest tier, a typical rating for Japanese type games, S being higher than A, and D being the lowest. The tier maker tool allows you to increase the amount of tiers and go down to F or whatever you like. For the sake of this particular series of videos, I want to use S through D for the ratings because there's not a whole lot for us to really evaluate here. But here's what I plan to do for this. This first video, as you can see down here on the bottom, is going to focus on the weapons from the original Guardian Legend game on NES. And these weapons, secondary weapons, are what you see here in the tray below the tier list. And what I'm going to do is, based on my experience playing the game, I'm going to rank what I think are the best and or worst of the Guardian's secondary weapons from the NES game. What I'll most likely do after this video is done is go into two other tier lists that I made on the site. And when these eventually get edited and uploaded to YouTube, what I'll do is I will link the tiers that I've made in the comments box or the description box. Maybe I'll pin a comment as well. And anyone out there who's a fan of either the Guardian Legend original game or Shadow of Naju, you'll be able to grab my tier lists and make your own. And so this first one will be ranking the weapons from the original NES game. The next video will be ranking the weapons from the fan game Shadow of Naju based on the quote-unquote story mode. And then the final video I want to make is a ranking based on Shadow of Naju's arcade mode, because the function and the way you get weapons in the fan game is a little different in arcade mode compared to the main story. At some point, I wouldn't mind going back and doing a tier list for the regular Guardian Legend arcade mode, but for that one, I feel like the weapons and the way you get them is a little more consistent with the main game, so the ratings wouldn't necessarily be that much different. But I'll have to think about that. So for now, we're going to focus on the three. Like I said, the first one, Guardian Legend weapons, NES. Second one, Shadow of Naju weapons, story mode. Third one, Shadow of Naju arcade mode. So what we'll go ahead and do is get started here. What I did in this tier list is I used the images from the Guardian Legend wiki to create the icons for all of the weapons you see here. And on my other screen, what I've done is I've organized this into a folder and I was able to pull the quote-unquote canon names of all these weapons off of the wiki. I know playing through the Guardian Legend and Shadow of Naju subsequently, I didn't have the canon names of these weapons memorized, so I kind of just called them whatever I wanted. But for the sake of these videos, we'll finally get the record straight, at least as far as the official wiki is concerned, and we'll refer to all the secondary weapons by their actual names. We're going to start left to right here, the weapons in the tray. And the first one here is the bullet shield. And I think for the sake of this video, or this part, I'll explain what the weapons do in-game just as a recap, if in case you're not familiar with Guardian Legend at all. For the second and third tier, I won't bother doing that, since it'll be redundant. But this first one here is the bullet shield. When you get this weapon and you turn it on, it activates a barrier projectile that orbits around your character, and it will absorb bullets and do damage to nearby enemies. This particular one is pretty useful when dealing with an onslaught of enemies coming at you and a lot of bullets. And before I put the rating in, another thing I want to use as a sort of rule for this particular tier. The ratings here assume all the weapons here are max level. Because in the original Guardian Legend, if you play through the game and get everything, it's possible to upgrade everything to, I believe, level 3. So what we'll do for the sake of this is assume every single weapon here is max level for the sake of ranking. Now, for the bullet shield, when it's at max level, it's a really large barrier projectile that orbits really fast. The problem with it is it's relatively expensive. The secondary weapons, with the exception of one of them right here, all consume chips, which is your ammo for your secondary weapons. And the bullet shield, while useful and pretty handy in avoiding damage, it will burn through your chip stock very fast at max level. So I think I'm going to put the bullet shield at B tier. It's useful, and I think level 2 is probably the most economical for function versus cost. But for the later game, when you're dealing with a lot of difficult stages, using the maxed out version will drain your chips pretty quickly, so I wouldn't exactly put it near the top. The next one here is the bullet shot, and this is the one I call the directional shot in the game, because when you use this weapon, if you fire it with a neutral input, it'll just shoot straight ahead, but when you're moving around, you can basically shoot it in different directions by hitting a direction and the fire button at the same time. Now, the bullet shot is tricky because if you're dealing with a fast target, you have to deal with evading and aiming it at the same time. As it levels up, the projectile gets bigger and gets the ability to fragment into sort of these shrapnel bullets that do additional damage. It's functional, but I'd say its use is a little bit better on the exploration stages versus the bosses. Overall, I didn't really use the bullet shot too much in the base Guardian Legend game, so I'm going to put that one down here on C tier. It's not the worst, but it's definitely not that useful, at least to me. There will be a slight difference in tiers for the fan game, but for the original, I'm putting the bullet shot at C tier. Next up, we have the cutter. This particular weapon, kind of like the sword type one over here, causes two beams of light to shoot out on either side horizontally from the Guardian, and it's functional in that it does damage on either side, but that use is so situational. I never really found a good way to use the cutter effectively in the base game. Because it has a limited range for the beams on each side, you have to get close to a target to hit it, and you're only going to hit it on one side. As a result, I'm going to put the cutter down here on D tier. Maybe someone else who's familiar with the game knows of effective situations where this one would be useful. Maybe some of the exploration stage mini-bosses, which tend to be easier to hit in some cases, could be useful for this. But I feel like you're better off using a sword projectile for that because it's easier to aim. We'll put the cutter at D tier. Next up, we have a unique secondary weapon. And these are the enemy erasers. These are unique in that they don't consume chips. These are a fixed stock. And I believe it's 40 in the base game. I know it was 40 in Shadow of Naju. Enemy erasers can be collected by getting power-up boxes dropped from enemies randomly. And as you consume your stock, you'll have to replenish it by getting those power-ups on the field or you'll run out. What they do is very simple. The enemy erasers wipe the screen. It's basically a nuke. In shoot-'em-up games, it'd be equivalent of a bomb that clears all the enemies out. One thing that's unique to Guardian Legend that Shadow of Naju didn't have is a glitch that allows you to spam your enemy erasers. You can basically spam them back to back very quickly, and when you destroy enemies, each time you spam the explosion, it re-rolls the chance of dropping a power-up. So if you have a lot of these on hand, you can basically spam them till you get power-up boxes, and it's a pretty effective way of getting through the game. That is not present in Shadow of Naju. But based on its general function and the fact that it gets you out of some pretty challenging situations, I'm putting the enemy erasers at S tier. It's, even though a finite quantity item, it's very, very handy. And there's a lot of situations you'd be stuck in if you didn't have them. So that's an easy S tier for me. Next up on the list, we have Fireball. Now this weapon, and canonically I called this the Fireball, and that's its canonical name too, according to the wiki. This particular weapon is interesting because when I played through the original Guardian Legend on NES, I slept on this weapon a bit. I didn't really use it much in the beginning, and it wasn't until I figured out how useful it was and started upgrading it that it became one of my favorite weapons. In fact, this one was my favorite from that playthrough. Basically, the Fireball at base level shoots a rolling projectile that'll pierce through enemies and keep going till it leaves the screen. At level 2, it goes a bit faster, and I think the projectile gets bigger, but at level 3, it's a large rolling projectile that goes through everything and does a ton of damage. It's very handy for dealing with things like the Optimon seaweed tracks, which is something that I realized pretty late into my original playthrough of the game. But overall, this weapon carried me through the base playthrough once I figured out how good it was. So I'm going to put Fireball also at S tier. And I think the way we're going to do this is we're going to rank them from best left to right. So if I feel like something is going to be better than something else in its own tier, I'll put it to the left. And we'll put it after the enemy erasers because while it's my favorite weapon from the base game, I think the screen nukes edge it out a little bit. Next up on the tier list, we have this particular weapon. What I call the Shockwave is actually called the Front Wave, according to the wiki. And this one's interesting. It's one of the first secondary weapons you pick up as you're playing through the base Guardian Legend game. And what it does is it shoots this sort of crescent wave in front of the Guardians. A fairly big projectile that you can sort of steer directionally side to side. And as you power it up, it does more damage, and eventually at level 3, it's a ring-shaped projectile that does pretty decent damage. Now, I didn't really use this weapon too much in my Guardian Legend playthrough. I feel like it's more useful than I gave it credit for, and I base that on how I would rate this one in Shadow of Naju. But for the original game, I'm going to put this one at a B tier. I think it is more functional than the bullet shield, just based on what I know now. Again, if I was rating this based on what I used in my original playthrough, it would probably be a D tier weapon just because I didn't use it. But knowing what I know now and how useful it is, especially early on, I think it's pretty functional and adds decent damage on pretty much any area, exploration or scrolling shooter mode, corridor mode. So yeah, I think I didn't give this one as much credit as I should have in the original playthrough, but I'm going to put the Front Wave at B tier. Next up, we have the Grenade. Now this one's a little bit tricky because I feel like this weapon is decent, but it has some drawbacks that make it a little bit difficult to use. When you acquire the Grenade, it functions as it sounds, in that the Guardian will toss out a grenade that flies a set distance away and then explodes into a sort of area effect. The direction can be steered using the D-pad, and as you power it up, the explosion does more damage and gets bigger. Earlier on, when you're dealing with some of the more slow mini-bosses and even corridor bosses, I feel like the grenade is functional. It does okay damage. You can sort of track enemy patterns and try and time your shots so that you're hitting with the full blast. The problem is, as you get later into the game and the enemies become tougher and the bosses get faster, because you can't rapid fire the grenade, it's got a pretty slow rate of fire and a pretty slow rate of trajectory. The ability to hit quick targets and do damage very quickly as far as DPS is concerned is diminished, even though it does decent damage. For me, I feel like the grenade use tapered off later on in the game in Guardian Legend. It could be used to clear out enemies, but overall I didn't find myself using this one as much. So I'm going to put this one on C tier, but I will put it ahead of the bullet shot. Just because it's a little bit more damaging, but kind of like the drawbacks of the bullet shot, it's hard to use effectively, and it doesn't really have a fast rate of damage. Next up on the tier list is the laser, which is the canon name, is what I called it in my playthroughs. Now, this one, I feel like this weapon, if I think back to the original playthrough, I used this one a decent amount, but I don't think I really relied on it a ton throughout the entire game. For the base Guardian Legend, I probably could have used this one more because the laser has some interesting functions in that, one, it's got a pretty quick rate of fire. Two, its projectile pierces. It basically shoots beams straight ahead. As you power it up, the beams split into two, and I think they get bigger in level 3. I don't remember. It's been a while. But they shoot through targets. And overall, it's very, very powerful and it stacks damage quickly. A drawback to the laser is it's only usable on the corridor stages. I think some of the ROM hacks of Guardian Legend changed that later, but for the base game, and I believe Shadow of Naju too, I didn't really test it, you can only use this weapon on the corridor stages. And as a result, I'm going to put this one at A tier. It's very strong, but it can only be used on essentially half of the content in the games. Based on the levels and boss layouts, I think I would actually rate this one an S for Shadow of Naju, but for the base game, I would say laser's a very good weapon. If you manage to get the upgrades to this one faster than you do with the fireball, I would prioritize using this one on the corridor stages. Its piercing and fast rate of fire do pretty decent damage, and it's good for most bosses. Next up, we have the repeller. Now, I called this one the circular shot in my playthroughs because that's basically what it does. When you use this secondary weapon, it fires in a circular pattern ahead of the Guardian and goes upwards till it leaves the screen. The upgrades increase its damage, possibly the speed, and it upgrades the size of the projectile as it goes up the screen. Overall, I would say this weapon is very handy. If I remember back to my original playthrough, I'm pretty sure this one pierces. It will keep moving through enemies till it leaves the screen, and at level 3 it is very decent damage. I do think that the function was outpaced by the fireball, just because the fireball moves in one direction and I think leaves the screen faster. But I would put the repeller at A tier behind the laser for the original game. Overall, it's pretty powerful and pretty useful in most cases, so I would give it an A tier rating. Next up, we have the sword type weapon, or its actual canonical name, the saber. This particular weapon, similar to the cutter, is a little bit more simple in that when you use it, a beam shoots right out of the front of the Guardian and stays out there constantly draining your chips and does constant damage. Overall, I'd say this one is pretty situational, but it is pretty high damage concentration. At level 2, it extends the length of the saber, and level 3 is the highest damage for this weapon. Because it's situational, but still useful, especially on certain mini bosses that aren't necessarily as fast, I would put this one at a B tier after the front wave. The use for the saber, I think, would be a little bit different in Shadow of Naju and Shadow of Naju arcade mode, but for base Guardian Legend, I would say it's pretty solid B tier. I have seen some speedrunners who are playing through Guardian Legend use it on the corridor bosses. They'll basically go all in right up on top of the boss, and they'll spam this in their face till they die and out DPS the boss before they die themselves. I think if you're focusing on a speedrun type strat, in that sense, this one will probably be either A or S in my opinion. But for general purposes, I'm happy putting this one at a B. It's functional and it's much more useful than the cutter. Next up, we have the Seekers. This weapon, I feel like in the original Guardian Legend, I used it sort of moderately, but there were other instances where it would have been more handy if I realized how useful this weapon was in reality. When you use the Seekers, a red projectile and a blue projectile come out from the Guardian, and they fly around the screen seeking out enemy targets for a set amount of time, depleting chips, and then once they disappear, you have to set out 2 more. And I believe for the upgrades, it's speed, and then the level 3 is the size of the projectile and damage. Overall, this weapon is pretty useful. It's pretty handy for dealing with fast targets, because you can sort of evade and then send the Seekers out and hit the boss without necessarily having to be close or in line. You can sort of play hit and run and get to safety, or hit the boss from safety. And that is pretty useful for both the corridor bosses and the exploration mini bosses. So I would put the Seekers, based on the original Guardian Legend, at the top of B tier. This particular weapon is definitely in a different spot for the fan game, and I'll talk about that later. But for the base game, I would say it's either low A or high B. We'll put it in high B for now. And last up, the final weapon here is the Side Wave. And this particular weapon functions sort of like the cutter if you combine the cutter and the front wave. The Side Wave shoots out 2 crescent-shaped projectiles on either side of the Guardian at a downwards angle outwards. So on either side, right and left, when you use this weapon, it shoots 2 projectiles out sideways, sort of at a downward angle. And this particular weapon I never use, I'll be perfectly honest. I tried to mess around with it even at max level, and I didn't really get any use out of it. The fact that it shoots backwards and at a moderate rate of fire is fine for some of the stages where enemies are coming at you, but I feel like if you were wanting to maximize your effectiveness, you either use something faster that can hit in front of you, like the fireball, the repeller, or the laser on the corridor stages, or if you're concerned about things hitting you from the sides, you can use the Seekers or even the bullet shield. Overall, I didn't feel like this weapon was very effective at all, really. So I'm going to put the Side Wave down here, D tier. It's, in my opinion, less effective than the cutter, just because the cutter stays out and it's constant damage, versus the Side Wave, which shoots projectiles at an interval. So I think that'll do it for this particular tier list. Based on the original Guardian Legend, I feel like the weapons sort of depend on your preferred playstyle, but the overall function versus cost and effectiveness is a little bit unbalanced. You have some weapons, like in my opinion, these ones in the bottom couple tiers, that don't really have consistent uses throughout the game and really sort of fall off once you power up some of these other ones at the top. But I'd be interested to hear what other people who played the Guardian Legend think about how these weapons are laid out. And like I mentioned before, I'll link these tier lists in the video description. So if anyone from the Guardian Legend community is watching this and wants to make their own tier list and compare notes, feel free to do so and then send it to me over on Twitter. I always think it's interesting hearing what other people's opinions are for stuff like this. But I think that'll do it for this tier list. I'm doing these all in a recording session, so I'm going to move on to the Shadow of Naju story mode. So I will see you guys in the next section of the video.